My class in counterterrorism began today, and I have to correct myself. The professor for counterterrorism teaches at William and Mitchell School of Law. His name is Radson, and um, that is in Minnesota. I'm not sure if that counts as the Midwest, but that's where it is. So, a couple of things have come up in that class. One of the themes is, well, I don't know if it's come up in class as much as it's come up in my talks with him. So, the idea of the separation between politics and policy and the law, and whether or not that exists, or if it's just an academic principle for the sake of analyzing things in the abstract. So, I was talking to him about whether the United States should abide by international standards for what torture is in their involvement in Iraq and getting terrorists when they do, and also in determining whether the war in Iraq is illegal, like whether the United States should abide by the Geneva Convention, whether it should abide by the UN Charter. So he was saying in the course of this discussion that my arguments for why the United States should abide by these things were politically driven as opposed to legally based, and I find that kind of confusing because I think that they're inextricable. So I think of laws as having a cultural origin, whether it's the Tablet of Hammurabi or the common law in England or the Napoleonic Code from France. They embody the cultural values of the places that they come from. So, and not only do they reflect policies of those cultures and how they're written and how they come to be, but also in how they're applied and where they're applied and how they're interpreted. So if we want to discover or unpack what policy drives a given law or legal system, looking at its application is a pretty good indicator. So in the case of laws around terrorism and laws allowing for coercive interrogation, if we look at the populations that it's used to prosecute or that are subject to it when applied, then we can see what the impetus for passing those laws might have been. And in the case of Chile, for instance, the Mapuche have been prosecuted under the counterterrorism laws passed under Pinochet, and they were prosecuted for having sit-ins, burning things down when they were trying to seize their land from companies. Their land had been taken under Pinochet and sold to private industry. So this is sort of a domestic revolt, is one way that you could frame it, or you could frame it as an act of terrorism, depending on the definition in the law. And if the law is broad enough to be applied to domestic uprisings or to peaceful protest, as in some cases with the Mapuche, then that tells us that maybe it was created just for that purpose. So this is how I think of the law and politics as interacting. I don't think that the law is created in a perfect moral vacuum in a mechanical or mathematical sense. I think that it's infused with the values that people hold who are writing them. So the law is used to validate behavior that is already occurring or is desired in a lot of ways. So in the case of the United States with torture laws, or with redefining what torture is, or what the United States considers torture, or whether the United States will abide by an international accord, we have cases where prisoners at Guantanamo have been waterboarded, and that happened before a law was passed, but it's causing a debate. Is that okay? And should we create a legal mechanism to validate it? So, to say that discussing law in terms of empire and imperialism when arguing against the war in Iraq is making a policy argument as opposed to an argument about the law is, I think, a little bit hypocritical if you can talk about changing the United States interpretation of what torture is after having breached their contemporary understanding or the previous understanding. So that seems pretty inherently politically driven. So another issue that's come up is that came up in class, talking about whether or not infiltrating the governments of client states or creating client states with intelligence operations is warranted in order to serve the interests of the United States. So I think that that's bad news because it diminishes the ability of the populations of both the United States and the client state from achieving self-determination. And by that I mean from being able to impact the policies of the institution, because they, rather than just facing their own government, which is hopefully relatively local to them, they're facing an alliance between two governments with interests that are distanced from their own. So there are a couple of things to consider. Like, when we say the United States, do we mean the people in the United States? Do we mean the United States government? Do we mean the people in power in the United States? Do we mean the wealthy? Do we mean people who are able to lobby most successfully in government? Do they share interests with the public? And how to determine what those interests are? That's one issue. And the other is one that another person in class brought up. Should we care about the ability of other nations' populations to achieve democratic rule, to achieve self-determination, and to successfully impact the policies of their institutions? Should we only seek the security of the United States? And when we say the United States, I mean that kind of goes back to the first issue: who is the United States when we're talking about the United States' interests? So, my thinking is that if we diminish the ability of other populations to impact their institutions and make institutions accountable to their interests, then we have angry people, other places that don't like us, that if they discover, and it's likely that they will because they have, that the United States is manipulating the people that are supposed to serve them, who are supposed to represent them inside the structure of a nation state, then they're going to rebel against that government. And when that doesn't succeed because it's bolstered by our military power, they're going to rebel against us. They're going to rebel against what they perceive as the big nasty empire. And that's happened. So, in that sense, if we're going to talk about national security, then manipulating the machinations of other governments and creating conflicts of interest for people in power and other governments really doesn't serve our interest in the long term. It serves it in the short term. It secures markets and it benefits, I think, the people in power of the United States right now, but it doesn't benefit me or the common person. And maybe in the long term it will benefit that elite class that's currently in the United States, but that doesn't mean that that elite class will necessarily stay with the United Statesian public forever. They'll go wherever they can maintain power and will still be maligned as the culture that took away the autonomy of others.